Thank you very much. My name is Anita, and I just want to thank the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences for bringing together women, judicial officers from across Africa to discuss this important topic. I also want to thank the International Association of Women Judges, and specifically also the Kenyan chapter, Justice Okwengu, for giving us the opportunity to discuss this emerging criminal issue. So my name is Anita Nyanjong, and I work, I'm a lawyer in Kenya. I have the experience of working in different African countries on the subject of trafficking, particularly trafficking for sexual exploitation. And I'm going to speak about the gender dimension of trafficking, and specifically around, sex trafficking, which I work on particularly. So my work ranges along policy work. I do a lot of policy in these African countries, specifically Malawi, South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, Uganda, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. I'm going to speak about this topic globally, but also just try to narrow down on the Kenyan context. So trafficking and sex trafficking particularly is a lucrative business. In terms of percentages, the International Labor Organization, the Human Trafficking Center, estimates that sexual exploitation nets about $99 billion a year, as compared to forced labor exploitation, which nets about 43 billion, domestic servitude netting about 8 billion. So sexual exploitation is the #1 profit-making business in terms of, if you look at other sex trafficking, other forms of trafficking. So the victims of trafficking are particularly women and girls. And in terms of sexual exploitation, 96% are women and girls, especially those who are trafficked for sexual exploitation. 4% are men and boys. In terms of forced labor, 63% are men and boys, and 37% are women and girls. That doesn't mean that somebody can actually be trafficked for labor, but actually end up in sexual exploitation. It's important to understand, how trafficking manifests itself in that context. So we have, for organ removal, we have about 82% of victims being men and boys, and 18% of those being women and girls. And other forms of trafficking, 76% are women and girls, and 24% are men and boys. So this is from the United Nations Office for Drugs and Crime, their global report of 2016. I said I'm going to speak about the gender dimensions of trafficking, and I want to narrow down specifically on commercial sexual exploitation. But I just want to say that sexual exploitation of women is influenced by historical and structural power imbalances between men and women, which exist in varying degrees across all communities. And it is related to power and control, as well as social norms that prescribe men and women's role in society and condone that abuse. Inequalities between men and women cut across the public and private spheres of life and across socio-economic, cultural, and political rights, and are manifested in restrictions and limitations on women's freedoms of choices and opportunities. When we look at commercial sexual exploitation, it's about using one's socio-economic power to gain sexual gratification from another. The power imbalance is inherent, and commercial sexual exploitation actually preys on the marginalized persons, whether due to their gender, their sexuality, the race, disability, immigration status, which actually cause further marginalization. So in terms of gender inequality, so the gender inequality is a constant in exploitation. So whether somebody is sold in prostitution because of poverty, whether they are deceived into signing contracts for jobs and end up in the sex trade, whether they are tricked by lover boys and trapped into prostitution, whether they are trafficked into temporary marriages for sex, or abducted as sex slaves during times of conflict, or sold as into child marriages and trafficked during natural disasters, or advertised and sold on the internet through venues like Backpage, or trafficked in organized virginity cells, This just goes to show that you can end up in the sex trade through various reasons. So in terms of all this, if you look at the issues that cause prostitution and some of the issues that cause sex trafficking, they're actually the same. So if you look at, for example, in prostitution, there are women who want to exit prostitution. There is coercion. There is the gender inequality and discrimination, and of course, male entitlement being at the center of prostitution. There is the issues around prostitution being inherently violent and actually show the systemic failure starting from childhood into adulthood. And if you look at they're the very same causes that actually cause sex trafficking. In terms of international law, has recognized this. Sustainable Development Goals have recognized the vulnerability that leads to sexual exploitation. Goal 1 has talked about poverty and how extreme poverty leads women and girls to sexual exploitation. Goal 2, Goal 4, and 5, generally, international law has recognized the subject of sex trafficking. Goal 5 has talked about, mentioned that 71% of victims are women and girls, trafficked mainly for purposes of sexual exploitation, and 98% of those are women and girls. So in terms of Kenya, we see that, where there is inequality, women are more susceptible to sexual exploitation. So so Kenya is ranked in terms of the gender inequality index, we are at 35%. In terms of women's access to employment is about 16%. In terms of women who have employed, who have access to modern sector employment is about 34%, so the rest are men. So it just still goes to show, where there is inequality, where there is gender inequality, that more women are actually susceptible to abuse. So in terms of the prevalence of violence against women, this is also very high. Child marriages, female genital mutilation still exist, including intimate and partner violence, which still manifests in Kenya today. In terms of prostitution, so of course, prostitution and sex trafficking are inextricably linked, although very different. And just as I had alluded before, the drivers of prostitution are the same drivers that of sex trafficking. So prostitution is actually violence against women in the sense that a majority of persons who are prostituted have suffered some form of violence, often sexual, before entering prostitution. And a vast majority of prostituted persons are victims of many forms of violence while in prostitution. And the prostitution itself is part of a long patriarchal tradition of making women's bodies available for men. And it's about exploitation of the inequalities that exist in our society today. It's also about the violation of human dignity of women when you place the human body and sex into the realm of the marketplace. The system of prostitution reinforces the objectification of all women and their bodies. It is a direct violation of physical and moral integrity of the prostituted persons. So what are we saying? We're saying that prostitution itself, as one of the leading causes of sex trafficking, should be looked into by judicial officers. And therefore, prostitution is an obstacle to a truly free, respectful, and egalitarian sexuality in society. But to tackle this, we must actually tackle the demand for sex in our society. The Committee on the Elimination of all forms of discrimination against women has described prostitution as an ideology that may need to even have a right to sex from women or social norms of masculinity that include sexual dominance and virility. The CEDAW committees are also confirmed that gender-based violence is being that gender-based violence against women is rooted in gender-related factors such as ideology of men's entitlement and privilege over women, social norms regarding masculinity, and the need to assert male control or power, or enforce gender roles, or prevent or discourage or punish what is considered to be unacceptable female behavior. So the Committee on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women has actually seen the correlation, the gender dimension around prostitution as it relates to trafficking. In conclusion, what I would like to say is that commercial sexual exploitation is a deeply gendered phenomenon that is rooted in gender inequality, and that all solution must focus on gender equality. There is need to look at the intersecting inequalities based on systematic discrimination between people in the commercial sex trade, as most are likely to be on an equal footing with their customers, quote unquote, who have both money and who have the choices. The commercial sex trade in itself reinforces the notion of women as deviants or as sexual goods for consumption. What is the way forward? We call for I'm calling for a gender equality approach. And in the gender equality approach, we are calling for the decriminalization of women in the sex trade. Most of our laws criminalize the women in the sex trade, but don't criminalize the men who are actually the buyers. We are calling for what is called an ecosystems approach, which is supposed to reduce the vulnerability of those in the sex trade. So we are supposed to look at, and I'm glad that we've already started mentioning the aspects around ensuring that there is equality in the law, issues around ensuring reduction of poverty, access to land by women and girls, access to financial resources, are all in terms of the ecosystem that needs to be put in place, because we cannot address sex trafficking without looking at the issue holistically. There's need to look at sex trafficking or trafficking itself as a holistic issue and not solve one issue. So the problem needs to be addressed from a gender equality perspective. There is also need to shrink the commercial sex trade by addressing the demand that drives the sex trade. Where there is no demand, there is no supply. So this, just like any other marketplace where there is demand, there will be supplies. There is need to penalize the buyers of sex in addition to the traffickers and the pimps. To reduce the trade, there is need to focus on the demand aspect of trafficking, of sex trafficking particularly. There is need to curb new ways of spreading the sex trade. We need to talk about online trafficking, and online trafficking either on WhatsApp, on the internet, and how this then contributes to the proliferation of trafficking in different African countries. So there is need to look into that. Finally, last but not least, there is the need to address sex tourism. In countries we've seen, for example, in Senegal, in Kenya, or in Senegal particularly, where prostitution is legal, we've seen many women and girls the resurgence of sex tourism, mainly from the north, and Europe particularly contributing to some of the sex tourism in Africa. There's need to address it from that continental perspective as well. So last but not least, in curbing trafficking, in curbing sex trafficking, there is need for political will. And this needs to come from our governments in terms of addressing the root causes of trafficking, ensuring that there is greater coordination between the justice actors, not only the judiciary. There's need for coordination between the police in terms of evidence gathering, in terms of training of judicial officers, or within the investigating arms of government. I thank you.